How's it going, everyone? This is Takai, and it's actually been a while since I've done some cinematography breakdowns here on the YouTube channel. And for those of you who don't know, I'm a freelance DP outside of this whole YouTube thing. And once in a while, I like to make videos where I break down camera and lighting techniques on the content that I DP. So this short film that I'm going to be showing you guys today is a short scene that I shot with my good friend Alex. If you haven't seen the short yet, you can click on the card that's going to show up right here, or if you're too lazy to click on that, then go ahead and click on the link in the description below. The first shot that we're going to go over is the opening shot of the short, and here we have a wide shot establishing the therapist and the patient talking to each other. And in this shot we have two windows right here, which if you were to expose for the ambience of the room, it's normally going to be very overexposed in these windows if I were to expose naturally for the ambience. But if I were to do that, the scene is gonna look very flat and boring. So we shot this with the Blackmagic 6K Pro, and what I ended up doing to start off is I added two NDs in order to darken the room and get it to this exposure level. And that made it so that the windows weren't so overexposed, and it's basically exactly what you see right now. But then the problem with that is that the ambience of the room is going to be underexposed and it doesn't look very good. And I was kind of going for a more moody, kind of natural look, but at the same time I don't want it to be too natural. I've noticed that a lot of DPs will tend to just not use lights at all and just ambiently light the room with practicals. For me, that's not how I like to do things. So to bring up the ambience of the room, what I ended up doing was I set up two 300D Mark IIs with two aperture lanterns, and I aimed it straight up at the ceiling. And what this does is that it adds a lot of ambient light into the room. I'm using like a technique called bounce lighting, where I basically just aim the light source at a wall or a ceiling in the room, and then all of that light is going to be bouncing into the room, and it looks very natural and it doesn't look very direct. And it's a very good way of adding ambient light into the room and having extra lighting control. And in my opinion, it lights the room in a way that's similar to raising your ISO, except normally you don't want to raise your ISO, you want to try to keep it lower. Especially with a camera like the Blackmagic 6K, you would want to ideally shoot at the native ISO, which is ISO 400. So in order to keep the ISO low and get the image looking the way that I want and actually have a lot more lighting control, we're going to add in a lot of different lights. And if you were to look at this scene right here, it looks kind of natural. It doesn't really look like there's that much lighting added into it, but it actually looks like this. It actually looks like this because of the two aperture 300Ds being aimed at the ceiling. And if you look at this shot right here where I turn them off, you could actually see a lot of silhouetting. So I wanted to add some ambience into the room by adding the two 300Ds here, and that helped make it not so silhouetted. And doing this just helps give the shot look like it has a lot more dynamic range. And what it's also going to do is it's going to preserve the highlights. So turning on the two 300Ds at full blast and lighting the room to look like the way it does now, what it allows me to do is it allows me to have a lot more control over the exposure of these windows and keeps it as normal looking as possible. And then also another thing with adding the two lights is that this lamp is properly exposed now. Normally if I were to expose for the ambience of the room, the lamp is going to be overexposed and it doesn't look very good. So having the two NDs inside of the camera and then the two aperture 300Ds lighting up the room, I could really bring down the exposure of the room and any of the highlights that are present inside of the room, and it gives it a much more natural and more aesthetically pleasing look to the footage. All right, so moving on to the next shot, which is a close-up of the therapist. The only thing I really added to the setup at this point is the key light that's lighting his face on the left side of his face. And this is actually an aperture 300D with a light dome Mark II and a grid attached to it lighting his face. And I use the grid so that the light isn't just spilling everywhere. It makes it a lot more directional and makes it so it just aims more straight at his face as opposed to lighting up the ambience of the room. And as you can see in this behind the scenes picture, this 300D is key lighting him on the left side of his face. And then also I chose the left side of his face because it kind of replicates the lighting of this window right here, motivating the light sources essentially. If I were to only rely on the light that is coming from this window, it's actually not going to be that much light, especially since I'm already darkening it by a lot in camera anyways. So I add in my own light, which is 300D, to just amplify the already existing light. And then the last thing with this setup is that I also added in a backlight right here, and that's just lighting the back of his head, so that just to create a little bit extra separation from the background. And if we go back to the screenshot right here, and you can see in camera it looks like this. It's very subtle, but that's kind of the goal of it. I didn't want it to stand out too much, and a lot of people would probably say like there's no motivation for a backlight to be there, and it doesn't really make sense. But in my opinion, like I don't like to follow the whole motivation rule to a T. There is a certain extent to where I agree with it, and I think it makes it look a lot more aesthetically pleasing. Like for example, the window over here, and the 300D, that's a motivated light source. But then the backlight, there isn't a motivated light source. But then in my opinion, like just seeing how the back of his head, I can't really show it to you guys because I didn't get a shot where the backlight is off, but having that extra separation just helps create a lot more shape onto the person's face, and also just helps it pop a little bit more. And overall, to me, like I try to find the perfect balance between motivation and more, I don't know, Hollywood cinematic type lighting. I don't like it to look too natural because then it just kind of looks crappy. So it's just one of those things where I'm just adding it to help make the character pop a lot more. Okay, so the next shot that we're going to be going over is this medium shot of the patient talking to the therapist, and the lighting setup is pretty much exactly the same. Normally my rule of thumb when setting up lights is just to be respectful of a production's time and the time and the money that they spent on the location. My rule of thumb is to always think to myself, how do I set the lighting up in a way that looks aesthetically pleasing, but it also gets the job done quickly? So I really this exact same lighting setup that I was using for the therapist, I basically just took the light, me and my grip, we just took the lights and then moved it. And then for the most part, everything is kind of set up already, set up on stands. And if we were to look at the lighting right here, I'm doing the exact same technique where I'm key lighting her with the aperture 300D, and it's motivated by the window that's right here. So it just gives it a more natural feel. But if I had not used the 300D, the light that you basically see, the little highlight that you basically see right here, is literally the only light that's on her face. Most of the light, like pretty much all the light that's on the middle of her face, that's the 300D. And if I didn't have that light on, the only real light that she would have is the light that's right here rimming her face, and it would just look very silhouetted and it wouldn't look very pretty. So this highlight looks really nice. It gives her a nice little rim light on her face, and then having the 300D just helps create a lot more shape on her face. And as you can see, we have the Rembrandt lighting here, and then there's a nice soft fall off, nice little gradient of shadow on her face. Lights up the face and the eyes very nicely because in shorts, it's important to be drawn into the person's face. If there's a lack of lighting on it, it's a lot harder for the viewer to actually connect to that. So, and as you can see in this BTS picture right here, like I was saying, it has a little light rim on coming from the window, and then you have the aperture just lighting the rest of her face right here. And we also had this lamp right here that's giving her an orange backlight. The orange backlight actually didn't really come off that strongly on camera, and it's not in the picture right here, but this same LED light that I was using to backlight the therapist, I also used it to backlight the patient. It's extremely subtle, but it's just a little extra detail, and you can see the light right here. And going back to the whole motivating light sources thing, this would make a little bit more sense from a motivation sort of standpoint. So for anyone who was just shaking their heads at the previous backlight, okay, well look, I got a motivated backlight right here for you. The last shot that I'm going to be going over is exactly the same thing. The only difference that I did was I went from shooting on the Sigma 18-35, zoomed in at 35, which on the Blackmagic I believe would probably be like a 60 mil or something like that, and I switched it to the Sigma 14-24 and shot this shot at 14 millimeters, which on the Blackmagic I think would be like around a 20 millimeter, and I did a close-up shot with the 20 millimeter. And this lens being a 2.8 lens versus the Sigma being a 1.8 lens, I had to compensate with the lighting by just bringing the lights in a little bit closer. So I would either turn up the intensity on one of the lights, or I would just physically bring it closer so I can match the exposure of the previous shot, even though the shots had two different f-stop settings. So the reason why I chose the 14-24 for this particular shot is the character reveals that she's behind something very sinister, and she ends up killing the therapist. And she has this like kind of freak moment where she goes very like, oh, you drank the coffee, it was actually me, I killed you. So to kind of help amplify that creepy feeling, I find it very impactful when the camera is physically closer to the person. And when you're shooting with a wide angle lens and framing for a close-up, the camera is physically a lot closer to the person. Like in this frame right here, I would say the camera was realistically maybe this far away from the face, which I don't know, that's like half a foot. Maybe what it ends up doing is it has this somewhat distorted look on the face, and because it's physically closer, like it just gives that feeling of being up close to the action. And depending on the context of the scene that you're using in, it kind of looks scary. And this is something that I actually really like to do when I'm shooting horror films, using the wide angle lens and framing for a close-up, just because the camera gets physically closer to the person, and then the camera being physically closer to the person, you are bringing the viewer physically closer to whatever it is that you're looking at. And if it has like this creepy factor to it, then it kind of just helps stick your audience like right in with the action. And to me, it just helps like draw in the more of the suspense factor. Hopefully that makes sense. And since we're a little bit closer to the face right now, I just wanted to point out that the lighting that I have set up, the 300D and probably the window, you have these two nice little eye lights right here. You can never go wrong with eye lights. Eye lights, they're just awesome. All right, so that's the end of the breakdown. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm gonna be uploading a few more of these in the future. And if you like them, be sure to subscribe and hit the like button and be on the lookout for more. And if you didn't like them, well, that sucks. You should just go home. I'm just kidding. All right, I will see you guys in the next one.